Welcome to Discerning Faith Podcast. I am Daryl,
I am Nathan.
and we're going to jump back into the Bible
Mm-hmm.
and start talking through some more books. We've been through the Kings and Chronicles, focused first on the Israelite kings, where we're mostly very much a disappointment.
Oh, for what was it, 19?
Yes. And then we kind of went into the Judaic kings, and there was a lot more hope and light there, but ultimately their rebellion was enough that they were taken off into captivity as well.
Yep, by Babylon.
Yes, by Babylon. Now we'll see there's a new player that will come onto the scene here, and we kind of alluded at that the last time. You know, and I think something that kind of just popped in my head, so hopefully it's useful, was to kind of talk through the difference in the exiles for both of the two different nations. So Israel kind of gets just dispersed.
Yeah. It talks about them with Assyria, and like they would conquer, they would bring you back, they bring new people in, it would just get scattered. This is where the whole Samaritan thing comes in with the intermarriage, is the Assyrians not really keeping too much of the original population there and bringing in all these foreign gods and whatnot. They get scattered by Assyria, but then Assyria gets scattered by other empires as well, which further adds on to the whole, things are not good and did not remain pure in the northern 10 tribes as far as anything resembling sound theology, sound doctrine,
or even a national identity left anymore.
Yeah.
Which is a more utter destruction. And this is just an extrapolation, I guess, on my part. I wonder if it's because there were no kings that followed the Lord.
Yeah.
Again, there were a few that might have tried a little bit for a minute, but ultimately they did evil on the side of the Lord.
Yeah.
Whereas Judah, we'll talk about them coming back to the Holy Land and being restored to some extent.
And after a brief period of exile.
Yeah. So we're going to move on into Ezra.
So kind of doing that. So we have Babylon comes in, they take over after 3 exiles. I think we talked about, and we showed on the timeline and everything. 3 deportations and 70 years of exile in Babylonian captivity. God said, be prepared for it. You're going to stay there. This is going to happen. But after such a time, God is going to bring them back, and they're going to essentially start to rebuild. And so that's kind of the hopeful note we end off on with 2 Chronicles with Cyrus, king of Persia. The Persians conquered, essentially, the Babylonians conquered not only Judah, but also the Assyrian Empire, which includes the northern 10 tribes. And then the Babylonians get conquered by Persia, or get conquered by the Greeks, or get conquered by the Romans, and so on. So
I think there's a prophecy about that in Daniel or something. We'll get there.
Yeah. So we're kind of moving. We're doing a bit of a condensed version of, there are other books I'll talk about Babylon specifically, but with the order of the books, we're going to jump pretty well straight into what's happening during the Persian times right now. So, and it's not bad, there are definitely challenges during these times, but there were a lot of hopeful things, some redemption going on, some rebuilding during the Persian times here. So,
well, and one of the big things that's different between most of the kingdoms at the time when they overtook other nations was the Persians were pretty open to letting you keep your culture, keep your identity, keep even your religion. And so we'll see how even open to that they are here soon. And so I think that's a good contrast to kind of go ahead and set up now and to understand.
Yeah. I guess while we're talking about the differences, we were talking about maybe bringing it up later, but I think this is a pretty good spot to do it as well. Persia kind of did a few things different politically than some of the other empires as well, where, we saw, or we're going to see a little bit more in the future with Nebuchadnezzar and I always think of the VeggieTales, Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar, so
don't get your theology from Veggie.
I mean, it's not terrible. It's not always 100% right. There were at least decent things, and I appreciate Shadrach, Meshach, and I'm a Benaboo, a bumblebee. I'm Benny. Stuff like that. So, where the heck was I going with? Oh yeah, but essentially that he was very much an autocrat and very much like sole authority. He obviously had his administration who had to run things for him, but the power really lied with Nebuchadnezzar. Versus the Persians, they had a king, but they also had kind of a early form of republic and kind of an early form of constitution as well. Not in a, this is the explicit document we have for all time moving forward, But one, the king's word, previous king's word was essentially law. And so it wasn't that, the king could say one thing one day and then change his mind, do something else the next day. It was whatever the pronouncement was. If this is an official decree, this is officially enacted, unless you can find like another previous one that overrides something along those lines, for the good and bad that come with that. Because we're going to see in some of these stories that there are people that try to manipulate that. And kind of getting to the second part with the kind of republic nature of that, there are different levels of administration that really kind of take rise in the Persian Empire. I'm trying to remember the exact way to pronounce it. Is it like satraps or something like that is how it gets worded out?
Yeah.
They do a lot more of a federalistic type of government as well, which we tend to think of that as always being good because of America, this, that, and the other. But it's like you see their inherent weaknesses with that as well, because that gives evil men a few more opportunities to try and do whatever evil work, wicked acts that they're trying to scheme up as well. So
whether it's furthering the evil of an evil king or undermining the good of a good king.
Yes. So if there's, I'm the weird American who's a theocratic monarchist and all that jazz, but every form of government has its trade-offs one way or another. And so this is, and we tend to think of these,
except for theocracy.
Yes,
it's pretty good.
If you're following after Christ, yes.
So I look forward to the day when that just gets all worked out by him, but unfortunately we have to live here now.
Yeah. So, but just at least telling you a little bit about that and realizing that a lot of these forms of government and whatnot, we tend to think, oh, there wasn't really representational government until 1776. No, a lot of these things have been looked over for thousands of years, actually. And so this is kind of a little bit of that first big empire experimenting a little bit more with the whole limited government as far as the head of it, and then kind of the federalistic standard as well. So,
yeah, well said.
So, background information for all that, but let's get on to the actual books with Ezra as well. So, you want to start it off since you have a son with the name?
Yes.
Feels awful fitting.
Actually, I have a few children that will be names be brought up here soon. And yes, we're weird. We like biblical names, but we don't like the typical Michael, John, and all that. So first, Cyrus, we're going to go back to, he has a proclamation for rebuilding of the temple and restoring the temple possessions taken by Babylon. And something interesting that when we were kind of doing our prep, we remembered is that Ezra's not even mentioned until, was it chapter 7 we found?
Yeah.
In the book. So it's kind of interesting. It's named after him and he doesn't even show up till then. But anyway, that's an aside.
During the proclamation, he says again, he's doing it because he's been charged by God to do it. We kind of talked a little bit about that with like Necho, king of Egypt. Again, God is still working in we think of it, we can easily slip into the mindset of, oh, God's only talking to the Jewish people during all this time. God is still clearly, if you read through the Bible, he is still working some way or another in all these other nations as well, trying to reach out to them, trying to get them to do good, try to get them to follow him. And Cyrus, you'll know, if you've had a relationship with God, no actual walk with him, but he at least respected the word of the Lord enough that he was obedient and having this decree that, yes, we're rebuilding the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem and restoring what was taken by Babylon. So,
well, many a times we see that throughout the Old Testament. It is your God. And with Nebuchadnezzar, as we get into Daniel, we'll see, we will worship your God. And now that may not be a full abiding worship. That would be a saving worship. But, and you have to remember the syncretism that was around during that time of, well, your God is obviously more powerful because he did these things. Even if you go back to Pharaoh in Egypt, part of that was the humbling of Egypt, but also the gods, and I put that in quotes, which you won't be able to see, but the gods of Egypt that God is like, no, these are not real. I am real. And at some point, there always becomes a humbling enough for them to acknowledge your God is at least stronger. And that's simply the way they would think of it. They wouldn't think of it as, oh, you're the one, it's the one true God, but clearly your God is more is more powerful and has done more than our gods could do. Even when you talk about, we talked about recently Baal and Elijah, and then I even think of Dagon and the Philistines we've talked about all those times. And there's a lot of times you hear from the lips of a foreign king, your God is this, so we will worship your God, or your God has saved you.
Yeah. Or I think of Solomon and when they're doing the temple preps, and he's writing to, is it Tyre or Sidon? I mix the two city states up all the time. He's writing to one of them for the wood essentially and whatnot. And he says, praise be to God, to your God that, because he also had a relationship with David, his father. It says, praise be to God that not only did he have that relationship with David, but that his son is also, that God is working through his son as well. So
Right.
all these other places are still seeing the work that the Lord is doing, even if they have, unfortunately, still a skewed perspective on who God truly is in the grand scheme of things. So,
and it makes me also think of, as a little bit more of an aside, is when Paul talks about, and I don't remember exactly where it is because I'm bad at references, but he talks about, I think some of the people that are working with Paul come to him and say, hey, they're preaching Jesus out of conceit, and all that.
Yeah.
And Paul just says, well, I revel in the fact that Christ is being preached.
Mm-hmm.
And this kind of reminds me of that. Yes, I don't think they got it. I don't think it was probably a saving faith for most of them.
Right.
But at the very least, God is being praised through it. And that's always a good thing.
Yes. So obviously you want them to have the full knowledge we're going to get on this side of heaven, but at least baby steps are a very good thing. Don't undervalue the importance of baby steps. So,
well, and most of the time it goes well for Israel when a foreign king, especially if they're in power over Israel, and acknowledges
and at least has respect for. Yeah.
So yeah, you want to go for the next step?
So they begin the work, and there's a chapter, maybe multiple, but there's multiple lists of names throughout about who all's returning from the exile, who's going back to Jerusalem to do the rebuilding. And again, it's one of those chapters where it's like, it's a long list of names. What's the importance of it? Most of these people, we have nothing else for, whatever they did. Again, there's a point to it. It may be you read it quicker the second or third or whatever time, but do remember that a big reason for these lists of names is that it is honoring those who do God's work. It is kind of doing a memorial to them for all of time for their faithfulness and obedience to God and his calling in their lives. And that is something that's worthy of respect. It is worthy to acknowledge and praise God for his faithfulness and the faithfulness of those individuals to God, to do the calling that he has brought them to. So
absolutely. Good point.
So as they go about doing that, temple worship begins anew as the restoration starts. Again, they can't do it fully yet because parts of the temple aren't fully built, but they at least begin to restore temple worship again. We talked about the importance of, again, centralized location where the orthodoxy and orthopraxy of the church, or at this time, the faith, the people of Israel, could be centralized and established, because again, you have just everyone just doing their own thing in the high places. There's a lot of corruption of what is true going on instead. So then you end up not really worshiping God as he intended. And yes, God does have ways he wants to be worshiped and other ways he does not. So,
yeah. And then opposition, of course, always arrives when the work of God is being done. And so a new Persian kings go ahead and halt the project, but after Darius comes to power, he resumes after he realizes he finds the previous proclamation. And so, again, that goes back to that form of government, which I think you were about to say.
Yep. So again, one of the new kings didn't have records on hand of the previous mentioned by Cyrus. Yes, we're doing the rebuilding. The people say essentially, and ironically, they use a half-truth in doing it. They tell the Persian king, oh, they're trying to rebuild the temple and this, that, and the other. And our history shows that this is a rebellious and wicked nation, and that they get very, just unlawful and this, that, and the other. It's like, technically, they're not 100% wrong in those accusations against Jerusalem, because God says the same thing of them as well. But the particular work here was by God, and Cyrus had ordered such, but the new king didn't have the records, and so it got halted until, again, Darius, however you pronounce it, goes back and checks the record. They're able to find it. It's like, no, this was supposed to be going on. Keep working. You can go. Yeah. And so it resumes again. The project is completed after that, and kind of as a celebration. Again, we talked about last time how there were periods where these festivals and these holy days that God had ordained had gotten lost for hundreds of years or whatever. And so this is one of those times where it's like the first time that Passover again is celebrated for such a long time. It's a big gathering and celebration. And so it's a big deal of being able to restore what was lost and what was good and true and given as a blessing to God through all of that. And so it's a really good incredible moment, and that there's a reestablishing of covenants with God, between God and his people there. I think it's about this time where we finally see Ezra show up again in the book. King Artaxerxes sends gold and silver offering with Ezra. I guess on the note of all the different kings and names, it can be a little bit confusing. So don't feel ashamed to look up any sort of timeline with Persian kings, because there were 4 Artaxerxes. There was also a Xerxes to make things a little bit more confusing. There were 2 Dariuses. And then the Xerxes, there were a couple of Xerxes, and then one of those Xerxes is actually the Ahasuerus, or Asurius, or however you pronounce it, from the Book of Esther, which we'll get to here in a little bit. So there's a little bit of back and forth, very similar names, and these do jump between different kings in a pretty quick succession in the chapters. So if you get confused about it, don't feel bad about looking up for a little bit of clarification of, okay, which king are they talking about here in the time? So
I think the other thing to remember is that the Bible is not always going chronologically, so we're going to kind of jump around in timeline from Ezra, and then I think Ezra and Nehemiah are pretty much chronological,
Yes.
and then after that it kind of jumps around for Esther, and then of course Job goes way back.
Yes,
because that's typically during the patriarchs' time.
At least where it's viewed. It's not even completely sure where it is.
We're not sure of that.
So yeah, it's like your your grandpa telling a story, and he's forgetful in some of the details, so he jumps back and forth from time to time. There's a little bit of that with how the chronological order is in the Bible. So
well, another thing is, like you said, we don't always know some of the books that we can't date them very well, whereas these have historical events that we can look at. This king was in power during this time.
Yeah.
So it makes it a little easier, whereas like you said, specifically like Job and things like that, it doesn't mention anything historical that we can figure it out. And then of course, and then we're going to get to Daniel eventually, who jumps all the way back to Babylon, and we're already in Persia now. So
and he'll go through the Persian times as well.
So
get a long history with that.
So don't let yourself get too bogged down in that. I mean, I think the timeline can be interesting and helpful to understand it, but in the end, just figure out what the point of the book is too.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So something that's interesting that happens is the Israelites come forward and they confess some sin. One specifically that kind of sticks out, I should say, is intermarriage with pagan wives. That's always a downfall for the Israelites. God warns them over and over and over again, and they just keep falling into it.
Yeah, they kind of say, we've done the same thing as Solomon did along the and look where it led us and turned out. Now, granted, they confess the sin and they start to take care of it right now. We're going to see in the next book where it's still a problem, so more work is being done to correct that particular sin as well. But yeah, essentially, again, for those of you who are not married yet and all that, I guess for a practical application, make sure you don't do the whole, I can fix them or I can lead them to you. If you're not together in the Lord before you're married, then don't pursue that. Wait until they decide to pursue on their own volition, that they want that genuine, faithful relationship with God. I know that can be hard with that sort of a thing, but find someone who is dedicated to God and to walking in obedience to Him and to growing with Him. Don't make yourselves unequally yoked, because as you see time and time again, that is a hard thing. If you're already in that situation, the Bible is clear in the New Testament, Corinthians, I believe, with that. Do be a witness to them. Continue to just stay in that marriage, and maybe it does say that there is a chance that maybe your witness to them can help bring them into a saving relationship with Christ. But again, if you're not there yet, that's a huge heartache, a huge burden. It's going to bring a whole lot of temptations and whatnot. It's just better to avoid that altogether at that point. So
not only that, speaking from experience, raising children is hard. I can't imagine doing it with someone who has a different mind and a different goal in raising children.
I see some of that, and some of those close to us, that one is dedicated and then the other was not, and so it creates a certain type of stress and anxiety on the children. And the children do still love God and whatnot, but it presents stress or sorts of obstacles for the children that they're not equipped to bear yet as well, and it makes it just so much harder for them. It makes it harder for the parent who is staying faithful. We pray for those situations and desperately hope that God works out such to bring them into a redemptive story and redemptive relationship through all of that. But it does come with hardships. So
absolutely. I think another word I'd bring is unequally yoked is not always a believer and an unbeliever.
Mm-hmm.
I think you have to make sure that, one, that the maturity level is somewhat close.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that God can't do things and that this isn't a prescription. This is more of a caution, I guess. But if you're either further along and the other person's not as far along, they can drag you back somewhat. And I guess the other way, it's probably good for you in theory, potentially, as long as you don't drag them down if you're the one that's not as far along. But,
and I'll add to that where I think it is, if there is that difference, it is better for the man to be further along because the man is to be the spiritual leader of it all.
Yeah.
We still see examples of where that still fails, like with Solomon and whatnot. But theoretically, if there is going to be that kind of a gap, it is better for the man to be the leader and to bring up, one, because the man is a spiritual head, but two, I think we've talked about with ourselves and with friends and whatnot, where, there is a desire from women for the men to be the spiritual head and spiritual leader as well. It's not just, oh, God said so, but it's also kind of ingrained in our design as well. So,
yeah.
Even if you are on comparable levels, there is still kind of that desire for leadership and whatnot from the man. So,
absolutely.
But that's sexist or something.
Yeah. No, I think that's good. And I don't think we had any plans of talking about that, but
we ran for whatever rabbit holes we were going to jump down beforehand. So hopefully that was a good one. So
hopefully God uses it for someone out there.
Mm-hmm.
So we see the confession and the correction start, but it's not finished. And I think I guess we're going down another rabbit trail because that's what we do, is I think sometimes we think that like the way to get rid of sin is always this miraculous, God delivered me.
Mm-hmm.
And can that happen? Sure. I'm not going to put God in a box. Does it happen sometimes? Yes. We've seen it, when we've heard testimonies of it. But I think most of the time it's a constant wrestling, especially if it's that one abiding sin that you have a tendency for, that we all have one sin that especially we tend to gravitate towards and we tend to have a weakness to. Some things are going to be a constant battle. We don't know what the thorn in Paul's side was. We think it was an ailment most of the time, but it could have been an abiding sin that he was struggling with.
Or a really annoying person. We're not sure.
It could be too. But, there's most of the time, there's not deliverance right that moment.
Mm-hmm.
It's a constant going back to the cross, going back to Christ, and working with the Holy Spirit to bring you in line with what God wants for you.
Mm-hmm. It's typically a slow transformation. If God does the miracle, that is to the glory of God and to the praise of his name. If God doesn't, and if he doesn't immediately just deliver you from it, it's because he wants you to rely on him, rely on his word, rely on the Holy Spirit's work and transformation of your life, which is also to the glory of God and to the worship and praise of his name as well.
Mm-hmm.
Both are for the same purpose. It's just different ways that God can accomplish it. And he tends to choose the one over the other.
Mm-hmm.
Probably because it also strengthens our walk when doing that with him. If everything was just always easy with the walk, then how much would we take it for granted and then end up backsliding anyway?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess kind of, I don't know if this is a rabbit trail off a rabbit trail, but if you have that type of sin or temptation that you feel like, I've offered this to God over and over and over again, and I still feel like I'm wrestling with this. Is there something wrong with me? Have I really never given it up? We've talked about there are the denominations that say, you've screwed up. You really didn't hold it over. I don't think that's right. I think that in such situations, it's you did hand over, and he's calling for another sacrifice of it again, and that is perfectly fine. Just keep on sacrificing it every time.
Yeah.
Keep on lifting it up to him. Keep on just giving it to him each time, and it may come up again. Just give it back to him again.
Yeah, and I think in our humanity, if it just goes away, we're going to probably start to think that we're something that has something to do with that.
Man, that was so great. I got rid of this problem on my own.
Yeah. I guess I'll go into this story. My dad tells me a story of, my dad was the quintessential sailor when he was young. He went into the Navy at about 17. And he did the typical sailor thing, cussing, drinking, and all that good stuff, right? Not good stuff, I guess. But he tells me a story of, he didn't realize how out of control his drinking was. And he went on shore leave with a guy who in his hometown and somewhere, I think I want to say it was like in Massachusetts or something. And he's at a party with this guy and drinking and all that. And one thing that my dad always said was his line was drugs and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And these guys were doing some sort of drug. And basically at one point, the guy looks over and says, "We're not going back to ship." And he drove him there. So my dad's stuck. "We're not going back to ship till you take a hit on this."
Mm-hmm.
And my dad's like, no. But finally he gives in because he's like, "I got to get back to the ship because if you miss ship's movement, that's a big deal."
Mm-hmm.
So long story short, he doesn't have a clue what it is.
Mm-hmm.
But he takes a hit and it's probably laced with something pretty strong.
Mm-hmm.
And he starts seeing visions essentially.
Mm-hmm.
He told me that, and I may misrepresent this. So Dad, if you ever listen to this, sorry if I butcher the story, but I think the point will still come across. He said he remembers all of a sudden he remembers being in the back seat of the car of this guy's car and looking up in the mirror and seeing this guy look almost like what you would think of a demon or something and start just laughing at him demonically and maniacally. And he's like, he's fearing for his life and everything. And at one point he jumps out of the car moving. So he thinks, and again, he said he was so out of his mind. He doesn't know what was real, what wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it was a bleeding between the spiritual realm. I don't know. But he said he runs to a payphone and he doesn't know if he puts a quarter in or not and tries to dial someone. He said he doesn't even remember if he knew who to dial at that point. And someone on the other line says, "You'll never get out," and starts laughing at him maniacally, something along these lines. And he said right then and there, he said, "God, if you get me out of this, I will never drink any kind of alcohol or do any kind of drugs ever again." And from that day forward, he never has done either. He will drink an occasional non-alcoholic beer once in a while.
Mm-hmm.
But even then, I think I've always gotten the sense, he's never said this, but I've always gotten the sense that he's like, I think I'm going a little too close to getting, so he just doesn't do that really.
I think you said before, like he woke back up on the ship, had no idea how he got there.
Yeah.
Was delivered out of the situation altogether.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess I didn't quite finish the story, but, and God can do those miraculous, amazing things. And honestly, my dad, I think would agree with me on this, that he didn't follow the Lord after that by any means until much, much later. That was probably in the early 80s. And then I don't think he was truly saved and gave his life to God until early 2000s. So 20 plus years later, probably. God still delivered him from that sin, even with him not following him, and miraculously. But again, that was a miraculous thing. That wasn't a normal way that God works.
God can do both, but
yes,
he tends to choose the slower process.
Yeah, and I think God knows us better than we know ourselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what he needed in the moment. Doesn't mean everybody would react to that the same way. Some might have pride and say, "Oh, well, I haven't touched a drop for 30, 40 plus years now.
Mm-hmm.
Good, look at me." And you wouldn't know, my dad wouldn't tell you that unless something brought it up. It's not like he goes around going, "Hey, did you know I haven't had a drop because of this?" And like, he told that story because I'm his son, and he's like, "Hey, this is what God can do, even if I'm not truly following it and everything." And so, so it's a cool story. It's a cool thing to see what God did. But I think sometimes we expect that God always will work this way, especially if he does it one time for us, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we have to be careful not to become weary in doing good.
Yes.
Right. And constantly giving those things to him and allowing him to work. But more importantly, yes, we want to stop the sin,
mm-hmm.
but most importantly, we want to lean on him mm-hmm. and who he is and make sure we don't do it in our own power, because we can't anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's more why a lot of the time God doesn't just get rid of it. And I may be repeating what you said, but that's just, I think that's a good word to think on and remember. Because in the depth of, man, I've done it again, I'm struggling with this.
Or even if you haven't committed the sin, you can still feel weary from the temptation just bombarding you over and over and over again. Am I doing something wrong to still feel this temptation? It's just God is allowing you to still feel those challenges to keep mm-hmm. furthering your walk with him.
Yeah.
So lean into it.
Absolutely. So, yeah. So I guess we can go to the key verse.
Yeah.
And so we're pretty close to a full episode. If you want to wrap up here, do you want to try getting Nehemiah first? That might take
we can
do an hour.
Finish here and get one more out of it. It helps us with spacing the timing in case schedules don't align. So
yeah.
You want to go over it?
Sure. So Ezra 7:10 says, "For Ezra had set his heart to study the law of the Lord, and to do it, and to teach his statutes and rules in Israel."
Mm-hmm.
And I think we should all strive for that, right?
Yep.
Let's see. A heart to study the law of the Lord, which, okay, we don't think of it as a law, although that is part of his word, but study the Bible.
Yes.
That we know who God is by studying the Bible. It's not about the Bible being our Lord and Savior, but it's about teaching us who he is and to connecting with him. Right.
And his commands. Let's not forget that it's not just a nice little wish list of suggestions, but God has things he desires strongly for us to do, to the point of it being a command. So that, following God's commands is another kind of way to to think about it there. So.
Right. But that doesn't stop there. You study it and know it, and that's great. But if it's not applied, who cares? Right. And so it says, and to do it. And then again, the next step past that, you're not done by just studying it and doing it, but teaching it and passing it on to everyone.
Yep.
That might become one of my new favorite verses. I really like that. So,
yeah. So set your heart on it, follow through with action, continue to help. Again, this is kind of edifying the rest of the people around you, whether it's in the body or outside the body, and evangelizing to them and bringing them into the flock. It's almost a kind of blueprints for the gospel, before we had the New Testament anyway, but it's one of those things that shows that God's character, his plan has been consistent for all of time as well, and what he desires for us. So it's not this whole Old Testament God versus New Testament God. God has always been the same, today, yesterday, tomorrow, forever.
Yeah.
We can take trust in that, and there's goodness to that. So, kind of an overview of Ezra, Persian times and all that, but also Ezra, we rebuild the temple. I guess to kind of give a preview with Nehemiah, while the temple in the city has been rebuilt, Jerusalem is still undefended itself. It has broken down walls, which is, especially in the ancient world, just an invitation for raiders, for enemies of the people there to be vulnerable and to be invaded and all of that. So,
well, especially when you're flashing all that wealth coming into the temple.
So we're going to see next time how that kind of gets resolved for that particular situation. But God begins a good work of bringing his people back, restoring the temple again, restoring true worship in Jerusalem, beginning of God's good work from the exile.
So I know we're trying to wrap up here, but I had another thought. Hopefully it's helpful.
More rabbit holes.
Is it significant to you that the temple is built first and the walls later?
Yes. I think we can, I'm trying to think of what the exact parallel and how I want to word it essentially is, but I think sometimes the practical can make us forget the order of things. Like, we want to take care of the practical things first, and then we forget that,
then the book of the law is found years later.
Right? Yeah, and we forgot, and we haven't had true worship for all this time. The practical is important, but it kind of reminds me of the whole Martha situation where Mary is at the feet of Jesus, and, there's a practical thing to take care of, because without what Martha was doing, they wouldn't have been able to enjoy the nice meal together and the company and fellowship there. But there is a proper order, a proper mindset in doing things. And so, again, restoring the heart of worship of God, particularly as a community, because we also tend to think of it very individualistic. This is a communal thing. So restoring the temple first, not just for those in Jerusalem, but for those surrounding and for the entire nation, first and foremost, gets the people refocused back onto God, his goodness, back on their sin and why God has allowed such things to happen before taking care of the practical after it. But since you asked the question, did you have any thoughts on that?
That's kind of where I was going with it. I think we can always get things out of whack, right? We can put the cart before the horse. But I also think sometimes we can be too practical, that we don't get to the spiritual, but also we can spiritualize things to the point where we don't get the practical done. I mean, I've heard the saying that you're so heavenly minded, you're of no earthly good. That's a bunch of crap, first of all, because if you're truly heavenly minded, you will do what needs to be done here.
Yes.
But that being said, I think it's not necessarily about being heavenly minded. It's about over spiritualizing certain things to where you're like, well, if I do that, maybe I'll miss out on an opportunity to do something more spiritual or something like that.
We're not Gnostics here.
Yes.
Don't fall into the Gnostic, like, oh, the material world is not important at all, or is even wicked and sinful, or this, that, or the other. No, they're both are important to God. I'd argue if we ever get into like a deep dive in heaven, I think there's a lot of physical aspect of heaven, and there's going to be a lot of similarities there. But essentially, God created the world and it was good. There is something to taking care of it still, even in its fallen state here. So,
yeah. And just a spoiler alert for that kind of conversation is heaven is not necessarily some other dimension. It's actually restoring of the earth as it should be.
Yes.
And now we haven't delved into that, so I don't have a lot of like full treatise on that yet, but that is something I'm starting to wrestle really with is, God created it good and he's going to restore that creation. There's going to be a new heaven and a new earth. So anyway, spoiler alert, but yeah, I think just remember that it is important that the temple came first because the heart has to be restored. And yes, I'm making a symbolism here between the city being the body and that the heart is the temple, right? The heart and the mind that worships the Lord, it has to be restored before we can do anything else. Then now we need to protect that heart.
Then there is a need for that protection as well. So
yeah. If the temple's not there, there's probably not as much protection. And yes, the people still needed, it's not a perfect metaphor here, but yeah. So,
and God takes care of both in his good timing. So
yeah. So can't have one without the other.
And
again, we're not Gnostics.
Yes.
I think that's all I got.
I say more rabbit holes we want to delve into, as many as we've gone through here. All right. Well, we'll hit off Nehemiah next time. But as always, thank you all for joining us. This has been Discerning Faith. The Lord be with you and bless you.